Before we begin, drop a comment below with your country and what time it is right now where you're watching. Whether it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in France, I want to know. Don't just sit back, tell me where in the world you are. Now, let's dive into the story. 3 Apache girls hanged upside down to dying, until the ranchers showed up. Wild West stories. The rope bit into Nayeli's ankles as she swung upside down from the oak branch, blood pooling in her skull like a gathering storm. 12 feet below, dust and broken glass glittered in the afternoon sun. Her sisters, Sitlali and Ixchel, hung beside her, their black hair sweeping the ground, fingers twitching with fading consciousness. The 3 Apache girls had maybe 10 minutes before the pressure killed them, maybe less. Through inverted vision, Nayeli watched the 5 men in the clearing, their laughter sharp as coyote barks. The leader, a rail-thin man with a burn scar splitting his face in half, was counting gold coins into his palm. Behind him, smoke still rose from the trading post they just destroyed. Her mouth tasted copper, her vision darkening at the edges like paper held to flame. She'd told herself she was done with violence. 3 months clean from the bloodshed that made her name whispered in fear from Tucson to El Paso. 3 months pretending she was just another trader's daughter, that her hands weren't stained with things that wouldn't wash away. But the burn-scarred man, Luther Kane, had recognized her anyway. Not her face, but her eyes. "Those are killer's eyes," he'd said before his men strung them up. "I know. I got him too." The rope creaked with each swing of her body, a sound like bones breaking slowly. Her youngest sister, Ixchel, had stopped moving. Sitlali's breath came in shallow gasps. Nayeli's fingers brushed the small knife hidden in her belt, the one they'd missed. But upside down, disoriented, with vision failing, she had one chance at the right cut. One chance before gravity finished what the rope started. The desert air smelled of sage and gunpowder, of her father's blood soaking into the trading post floor where he'd died defending a lockbox he'd sworn never to open. That box now sat at Luther's feet, its contents scattered in the dirt, not gold or deeds, but letters. Dozens of them, written in her father's careful hand, addressed to someone named McKenna Rourke. Luther held one up to the light, squinting at words Nayeli had never been allowed to read. "Your daddy had secrets worth more than gold, girls," he drawled, his accent thick as molasses. "And old McKenna's gonna pay a king's ransom to keep 'em buried." The name meant nothing to Nayeli, but Luther spoke it with the reverence men usually reserved for legends. Her vision tunneled further, the world shrinking to a pinpoint of brightness surrounded by gathering dark. Single rider, coming fast from the eastern ridge. Luther's men drew their weapons, forming a loose semicircle facing the sound. Through the haze of oxygen starvation, Nayeli watched a figure emerge from the heat shimmer, tall in the saddle, moving with the fluid grace of someone born to violence. The horse was a paint, its coat the color of storm clouds. The rider wore no hat, and sunlight caught in hair the color of old copper. Not lawmen. Not cavalry. Something else. Luther's hand went to his pistol but didn't draw. Well, he said, voice losing its playful edge. "Didn't expect to see you in these parts, Rourke." The rider dismounted in one smooth motion, and Nayeli's fading consciousness caught on a detail that didn't fit. The rider was a woman, tall and rangy, with a face carved from granite and eyes like winter sky. She looked at the hanging girls with no expression at all. "Cut them down, Luther," the woman said, her voice low and rough as wind through canyon stone. "Or what?" Luther smiled, showing yellow teeth. "You gonna make me?" The woman, McKenna Rourke, said nothing. She simply stood there, hands loose at her sides, while the desert held its breath. Nayeli's knife slipped from her fingers. The world went black. She didn't see what happened next. Didn't hear the first gunshot or the screams that followed. Consciousness left her like water through cupped hands, and the last thing she felt was falling, not toward the ground, but into a memory she'd buried so deep she'd almost forgotten it existed. A memory of another hanging, another rope, another woman who'd come too late to save anyone. A memory that explained why her father had written all those letters, why he'd kept that lockbox sealed for 15 years, why he'd looked at her sometimes with such profound sadness. When she woke, if she woke, Nothing would ever be the same. The past she'd run from was about to collide with a present she didn't understand, and somewhere in between was a truth that men killed to keep hidden. 3 weeks earlier, the trading post had been a place of laughter. Nayeli's father, Takoda, swept the porch while humming old Apache songs, his weathered face creased with contentment. The post sat at a crossroads where 4 territories met: Apache land to the south, rancher country to the north, mining claims to the east, and lawless badlands to the west. Everyone passed through eventually, and Takoda treated each traveler the same, whether they were cavalry officers or wanted men. "A man's business is his own," he'd say. "What matters is how he treats people when no one's watching." Nayeli had heard the philosophy 1,000 times, but she'd never believed it. She'd seen too much of the world's cruelty to trust in simple kindness. At 23, she was the oldest of 3 sisters, the one who'd left home at 16 to learn a different trade than storekeeping. Lali, 19, was grinding corn when the first stranger arrived, a Mexican prospector named Ernesto, his burro loaded with mining equipment. He needed supplies for a 2-month expedition into the Sierra Madre, and he paid in silver that rang true on the counter. While Takoda filled his order, Ernesto told stories of a legendary mine where Apache warriors had supposedly hidden Spanish gold during the rebellion of 1680. "They sealed it with blood magic," he said, eyes glowing with fever-dream certainty. "Only Apache hands can open it. Only Apache blood can break the seal." Ixchel, 16 and still innocent enough to believe in magic, leaned forward eagerly. But Nayeli saw the calculation in Ernesto's eyes, the way he watched her sisters like a prospector evaluating ore. He wasn't looking for gold. He was looking for Apache girls desperate or foolish enough to risk a curse. The second stranger arrived at sunset, a woman in rancher's clothes, her face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. She purchased coffee, jerky, and ammunition without speaking, but as she turned to leave, she paused. "Takoda," she said quietly. "It's been a long time." The voice was rough and used to softness, but underneath Nayeli heard something else: old grief, older rage. Her father went very still, his knuckles whitening on the counter. "Get out," he said, and it was the first time Nayeli had ever heard him speak with pure hatred. "You don't get to come here. You don't get to say my name." The woman stood motionless for a heartbeat, then nodded once and walked out. Through the window, Nayeli watched her mount a paint horse and disappear into the gathering dusk. She turned to her father, questions forming, but his expression stopped her cold. That night, Takoda did something he'd never done before. He got drunk. Not tipsy or cheerful, but devastatingly, frighteningly drunk, the kind that loosens tongues and drowns judgment. He sat on the porch with a bottle of whiskey, staring at stars that glittered like scattered diamonds, and he talked. About a woman named McKenna Rourke who'd once been his closest friend, closer than any brother. About a partnership they'd formed during the Apache Wars, running messages between tribes and settlers who wanted peace. About a betrayal that had cost lives, so many lives, and fractured something that could never be repaired. "She chose wrong," Takoda said, his words slurring. "When it mattered most, when everything hung in the balance, she chose her own people over the truth." He never explained what choice, what truth. Before Nayeli could ask, he'd passed out, and by morning he refused to discuss it. He locked something in the back room, something in a small wooden box, and wore his silence like armor. The third stranger arrived a week later, and he brought death with him like a calling card. Luther Kane walked into the trading post at noon, 4 men flanking him, all carrying the kind of casual violence that men wear when they've killed so often it no longer requires thought. He was looking for McKenna Rourke, he said. Had business with her. Important business. "She doesn't come here," Takoda said flatly. "You're wasting your time." Luther smiled, and the burn scar on his face twisted the expression into something monstrous. "See, I think you're lying, old man. I think you know exactly where she is. And I think you've got something she wants back real bad." He gestured to his men, who began searching the store with systematic brutality, overturning shelves, breaking open crates. When Takoda tried to stop them, Luther backhanded him almost casually, sending the older man sprawling. Nayeli's hand went to the knife in her boot, the same knife she'd carried through 2 years of blood work, but Citlali grabbed her wrist. "Don't," her sister whispered. "Please don't." So Nayeli stood frozen while Luther found the lockbox, while her father begged him to leave it alone, while everything she'd built collapsed around her like a house of rotted wood. Nayeli had stopped killing 2 years ago on a Tuesday in Prescott, when she'd put a bullet through a man's eye and felt absolutely nothing. That absence of feeling, that void where horror or regret should have lived, had terrified her more than any nightmare. She'd been 19, working as an enforcer for a mining consortium that didn't want claim jumpers or union organizers disrupting profits. The work paid well. The work required no questions. The work transformed her from Takoda's daughter into something else entirely, a weapon men hired when negotiation failed. She'd been good at it. Too good. The man in Prescott had been her 14th kill, though she'd stopped counting at 10. When she'd looked in the mirror that night, she'd seen her father's disappointment reflected back at her, and she'd realized she'd become everything he'd raised her not to be. Coming home had been an act of cowardice disguised as redemption. She'd told herself she was seeking peace, seeking to reconnect with family, seeking to become herself again. But the truth was simpler and uglier. She was running. Running from the reputation she'd built, from the men who wanted her dead, from the person she'd become when violence was easier than virtue. For 3 months, she'd played the role of dutiful daughter, helping at the trading post, teaching her sisters to track and shoot, pretending the past was buried deep enough to stay hidden. But the past never stayed buried. It just waited for the right moment to claw its way back to the surface, bringing all its accumulated rot and ruin with it. Luther Kane had been the spade that broke through the dirt. The lockbox sat on Luther's saddle when they took Takoda. The old man had fought, of course he'd fought, and one of Luther's men had clubbed him unconscious with a rifle butt. They dragged him onto a horse, hands bound, blood streaming from a gash above his eye. "Leave him," Nayeli had shouted, her hand finally drawing the knife. But Luther already had a gun to her father's temple, and the calculation was simple. She could kill maybe 2 of them before the others shot her dead, and Takoda would die anyway, his brains painting Luther's saddle. "You want him alive," Luther said, reading her perfectly. "You come with us. You and your pretty sisters. We're gonna have a conversation about loyalty and family secrets." Citlali started to cry. Ixchel's face went blank with terror. And Nayeli made the choice that would haunt her. She lowered the knife and surrendered. They rode east into Badlands country, where law meant nothing and the desert swallowed screams before they could travel far. The journey took 3 hours, the sun beating down mercilessly, turning the landscape into something biblical and punishing. Luther rode in front, whistling old war songs, while his men took turns describing what they'd do to the sisters once business was concluded. Nayeli memorized each voice, each threat, each name. She'd killed for money before. Killing for family would be simpler, purer. When they reached the clearing, a bowl of land surrounded by red rock walls, isolated and perfect for atrocity, Luther finally opened the lockbox. Inside were the letters, dozens of them, all addressed to McKenna Rourke. "Your daddy wrote to her every month for 15 years, Luther said, rifling through them. "Never sent a single one. Just kept writing, kept pouring his heart out like she'd ever read them, ever care." He selected one at random and read aloud, his voice mocking in its gentleness. "McKenna, I saw Nayeli smile today. Really smile, not the careful thing she shows strangers. She was playing with Citlali in the creek, and for a moment she looked like the girl she was before the war took her childhood. I wish you could have seen it. I wish many things." Luther looked up, grinning. "Touching, ain't it? The old man still loves her, even after she got his whole tribe killed." Takoda, conscious now but barely, shook his head weakly. "You don't understand." Luther kicked him in the ribs. "I understand just fine. And McKenna's gonna pay everything she's got to keep these letters from going public. Gonna destroy what's left of her reputation, and I'm gonna be rich." That was when Nayeli lunged for him, when Luther's men grabbed her and her sisters, when the rope came out and the hanging began, not to kill, but to hurt, to terrorize, to break them slowly while they waited for McKenna Rourke to arrive. The rope had been ascending for maybe 5 minutes when Nayeli's world inverted and the blood started its fatal pooling. Upside down, watching her sisters lose consciousness one breath at a time, she'd finally understood the full scope of Luther's cruelty. This wasn't about ransom or money. This was about revenge so old and deep that it had fermented into something toxic. Luther crouched beside Takoda, showing him each letter before feeding it to a small fire he'd built. 15 years of love letters, he said softly. 15 years of a man torturing himself over a woman who don't deserve his forgiveness. I'm doing you a favor, old man. I'm burning away your weakness. Takoda's eyes, swollen nearly shut, tracked the flames with devastation that went beyond physical pain. Each letter curling into ash was a piece of himself dying. She'll come, he whispered. She always comes. But she hadn't come. Not for 10 minutes, not for 20. Nayeli had hung there, calculating angles and distances, trying to reach her knife while consciousness ebbed. She'd killed men in close quarters before, but never from this position, never with her sister's lives in the balance, never with her own brain slowly crushing itself from blood pressure. Below, Luther's men had started drinking, passing a bottle between them, making increasingly violent promises. The shortest one, a man named Pike with dead eyes and pockmarked skin, kept looking at Ixchel with an expression that made Nayeli's stomach turn. When we're done with business, he said, I want the young one. Luther had laughed, neither agreeing nor disagreeing, and that ambiguity was somehow worse than a direct answer. It left room for imagination, for escalation, for cruelties that would never be named but always remembered. Then something strange happened. A hawk had circled overhead, its cry sharp and piercing, and Luther had looked up with sudden tension. That's a scout call, he'd said quietly. Someone's coming. His men spread out, weapons ready, facing the eastern approach. But the hoofbeats, when they came from the west, from the Badlands where no sane person rode. McKenna Rourke appeared like a ghost materializing from heat shimmer, and the moment Nayeli saw her, even through failing vision, she understood why her father had written those letters. This was a woman who carried death comfortably, wore it like a second skin. Tall and lean, moving with economy that spoke of countless fights survived, she looked neither left nor right as she approached. Her eyes, winter sky blue, cold and assessing, swept the scene once and understood everything. The hanging girls. The burning letters. The broken man on the ground. She said nothing. Just stood there, letting the silence build until it felt like pressure before a storm breaks. Cut them down, Luther, McKenna had said, her voice carrying despite its quietness. Or what? Luther replied, and his smile was a challenge older than this particular confrontation. These two had history, Nayeli realized. This was a debt being collected, a wound being reopened. Or I'll kill you, McKenna said simply. And your men. And I'll take my time doing it. Luther's smile widened. You're outnumbered 5-1. You ain't armed, I can see that from here. And even if you were, you're what, 50 now? 51? Getting old, McKenna. Getting slow. It was true. McKenna wore no visible weapons. No gun belt, no rifle scabbard, no knife sheath. She stood in the clearing completely unarmed, and that impossibility had made everything suddenly more terrifying. Luther's men shifted nervously. Pike's hand trembled on his pistol. Because if McKenna Rourke was famous for anything, it was for understanding violence at a level that transcended tools. I'm going to count to 3, McKenna said. By 3, they're on the ground and breathing, or you're dead. 1. Luther's smile finally faltered. He gestured to his men. Shoot her. Nothing happened. I said shoot her. Still nothing. The men stood frozen, and Nayeli, consciousness fading in and out like a guttering candle, saw why. Each of them was looking at something behind McKenna, something in the rocks. 2, McKenna continued calmly. Luther finally looked, and his face went pale. Nayeli managed to turn her head just enough to see what they were seeing. In the rocks surrounding the clearing, on every outcropping and vantage point, stood figures. At least 20 of them, all Apache, all armed, all watching with the patient stillness of people who'd been hunting these badlands for generations. Her people. Her father's people. The warriors McKenna had supposedly gotten killed 15 years ago had returned, older but very much alive, and they'd brought their children with them. Luther's hand went to his gun, knowing it was futile. 3, McKenna said, and hell broke loose. 15 years earlier, McKenna Rourke had been 36 when she'd first met Dakota at a peace negotiation that was doomed before it started. She'd been a scout for the cavalry then, one of the few women they'd allowed in that capacity, and her job had been to find Apache camps so the government could relocate families to reservations. But Dakota had found her first, walking into her camp at dawn with his hands empty and his eyes full of desperate hope. "I want to propose something impossible," he'd said. "I want you to help me save both our peoples." She should have shot him. Should have called for backup. Instead, she'd listened as he'd outlined a plan so audacious it bordered on madness. A network of Apache scouts and white allies who would expose the corrupt Indian agents stealing supplies, the ranchers starting conflicts to justify land grabs, the politicians profiting from continued warfare. They'd worked together for 3 years, documenting atrocities on both sides, building evidence that could force genuine reform. Dakota had been married then, with a young daughter named Nayeli who followed him everywhere like a shadow. McKenna had watched him play with the child, teaching her tracking and languages and how to read the desert like a book, and she'd felt something shift in her chest, a longing for a life she'd never allowed herself to imagine. But the work had been everything. They'd been so close to exposing the corruption, so close to forcing Congress to act. And then the massacre at Black Creek had happened, and everything had burned. 37 Apache families slaughtered by militia men who'd been told, by someone, that warriors were planning an uprising from that location. Someone had leaked information. Someone had betrayed the peace. Present, the clearing. Nayeli's knife finally cut through rope, and she was falling, hitting hard dirt with impact that drove the air from her lungs. Hands grabbed her, Apache hands, familiar and careful, lowering her sisters with more gentleness. Around them, gunfire cracked like thunder, but the fight was already over. Luther's men lay dead or dying, their ambush turned against them with brutal efficiency. Luther himself knelt in the dirt, hands behind his head, while 2 warriors held rifles to his skull. McKenna stood over him, her face still showing no emotion at all, and that blankness was more frightening than rage. "Who hired you?" she asked quietly. Luther spat blood. "Go to hell." McKenna nodded to one of the warriors, who pressed his rifle barrel against Luther's knee. "Who hired you?" The pressure increased. Luther screamed. "Caldwell. Marcus Caldwell. The rancher." Past, the night of betrayal. McKenna had been the one who'd sent the message about Black Creek. She'd encoded the location of families who needed supplies, sent it through their usual channels, trusted their network. But someone had intercepted it, decoded it, passed it to men who'd seen opportunity instead of humanity. When she'd arrived at Black Creek 2 days later, the bodies had still been warm. Women, children, elders, slaughtered indiscriminately. And Dakota had been there, kneeling in blood, holding his wife's body. She'd taken 3 bullets defending their daughter. Nayeli, 8 years old, had watched from a hiding place her mother had pushed her into moments before dying. Dakota had looked up at McKenna with eyes that held no accusation, only unbearable grief. "They knew," he'd said. "Someone told them exactly where we'd be." And McKenna had known, in that moment, that everything they'd built was poison. Present, recognition. Nayeli's vision cleared slowly, the world righting itself in increments. She saw her father being tended by an old woman whose face was familiar from childhood, Grandmother Cheveo, who'd taught her to weave, who'd supposedly died at Black Creek. Alive. Very much alive. All around, the survivors of that massacre emerged from their positions in the rocks, and Nayeli understood with dawning horror that her entire childhood had been built on a lie. These people hadn't died. They'd scattered, gone underground, lived in the shadows for 15 years. "Why?" she croaked, her voice raw. Grandmother Cheveo looked at her with infinite sadness. "Because McKenna convinced us that our deaths would save more lives than our survival. That if the government thought they'd won, they'd stop hunting us. And she was right. But the cost." She trailed off, looking at Dakota. "The cost was everything. Past the decision. Dakota had given McKenna a choice that night at Black Creek, standing among the dead. "Help me disappear them," he'd said. "The survivors. Take them somewhere the government will never look. Fake their deaths. Give them a chance to rebuild away from all this." It had meant abandoning their investigation, abandoning justice, abandoning everything they'd worked for. It had meant becoming complicit in covering up the massacre, because reporting it would have exposed the survivors' locations. "You'll be alone," McKenna had said. "You and Nayeli, staying here to maintain the fiction." Dakota had nodded. "I know. But they'll live. That's what matters." So McKenna had done it. Had moved 73 people across 3 territories, established them in hidden canyons in the Badlands, given them tools and supplies and secrecy. And she'd carried the guilt of those 37 dead like stones in her chest, because she'd been the one whose message had been intercepted. She'd been the security breach. Present, the truth spoken. "Who was it?" Nayeli asked, struggling to her feet. "Who intercepted your message?" McKenna finally showed expression, a flicker of old rage crossing her face like lightning. "Marcus Caldwell. He was a lieutenant then, assigned to peace negotiations. He was part of our network. Or so we thought." She looked down at Luther, who'd gone very quiet. "He's been covering his tracks ever since. Every few years, someone gets close to the truth, and they disappear. Every few years, he sends men like Luther to tie up loose ends." She turned to face the gathered Apache, and her voice carried. "I should have killed him 15 years ago. I chose law over justice. I chose to believe the system would eventually punish him. I was wrong. But I won't make that mistake again." The warriors murmured approval. Dakota, conscious now and standing with help, shook his head. "More blood won't. More blood is the only language he understands," McKenna interrupted. "And this time I'm speaking it clearly." Marcus Caldwell's ranch sprawled across 3,000 acres of prime grazing land north of the trading post, a testament to wealth built on blood money and stolen valor. He'd climbed from lieutenant to colonel during the Indian Wars, earning commendations for battles he'd orchestrated through leaked intelligence and manufactured provocations. After the wars, he'd parlayed his military reputation into political influence, becoming territorial governor's right hand and the richest man in 4 counties. His cattle bore a brand that looked like praying hands, irony that wasn't lost on the families whose land he'd acquired through strategic violence. Now, at 54, he lived in a fortified compound with 20 armed men, believing himself untouchable. He'd survived 3 assassination attempts, 2 congressional inquiries, and 1 divorce. He hadn't expected a ghost from 15 years ago to ride through his gates at midnight with an Apache war party. Nayeli rode beside McKenna, her body screaming protest from the hanging, but her mind sharp with purpose. Behind them came 30 warriors, Dakota, and her sisters, the latter insisting on coming despite their own injuries. "He took our mother," Citlali had said flatly. "He doesn't get to breathe while she's in the ground." Ixchel said nothing, but her eyes held a hardness that hadn't existed 6 hours ago. Violence had a way of aging people faster than years ever could. The ride had taken 3 hours, moving under cover of darkness through terrain that would have been impassable to anyone who didn't know these badlands intimately. Luther, bound and gagged, rode with them. Insurance, McKenna called it. Leverage. Nayeli suspected he'd be dead before sunrise, payment for services rendered to the wrong master. The ranch appeared suddenly, lights blazing against the darkness, music and laughter spilling from the main house. Caldwell was entertaining, apparently. Politicians and businessmen, their horses corralled in expensive tack, their guards drinking and gambling in the bunkhouse. McKenna signaled a halt at the tree line, studying the compound with professional assessment. 20 men on site, maybe 25. Plus whatever guests are armed. She looked at the warriors. "Can you take the bunkhouse without killing everyone? Some of those men are just hired hands who don't know what they're working for." A young warrior named Kale, maybe 25, shook his head. "They're all complicit. They all chose to work for a killer." McKenna's jaw tightened. "I'm asking you to be better than he is. Show mercy where you can." Kale spat. "Like he showed mercy at Black Creek?" The silence that followed was heavy with old grief. Finally, an older warrior named Needy spoke. "We do this clean. Disable, don't kill, unless they force our hands. We're warriors, not murderers. We know the difference, even if they don't." They moved like shadows, splitting into groups with practiced coordination. Nayeli went with McKenna and Takoda toward the main house, while warriors circled to the bunkhouse and perimeter positions. The night smelled of pine and horses, of expensive tobacco and fierce sweat. Nayeli's hand found her knife, reclaimed from Luther's men, and the familiar weight steadied her. She'd promised herself she was done killing, but that promise had been made in peacetime, when violence felt like a choice rather than an inevitability. Tonight, violence was the language being spoken, and she'd be damned if she forgot how to speak it. McKenna moved ahead, completely silent, and Takoda followed with more difficulty, his injuries from Luther's beating slowing him. When Nayeli touched his arm in concern, he shook his head. "I have to see him," he whispered. "I have to look him in the eyes when he realizes his past finally caught him." They entered through a kitchen window, bypassing a guard who'd fallen asleep at his post. Inside, the house was oppressively luxurious, thick carpets, oil paintings, furniture shipped from back east. The sound of men's laughter echoed from a dining room down the hall. McKenna led them through servant corridors, moving with the confidence of someone who'd studied floor plans in advance. Which she had, Nayeli realized. This wasn't a spontaneous raid. This was something McKenna had been planning for years, just waiting for the right moment, the right justification. They paused outside the dining room, where Caldwell's voice carried clearly, "Savages are nearly gone anyway. Another 5 years and the territory will be completely civilized. Indians will be nothing but stories we tell our grandchildren." Laughter. Agreement. The sound of glasses clinking in toast. Nayeli looked at her father and saw tears streaming down his face. McKenna kicked the door open. The room fell silent. 10 men sat around a long table, wine glasses suspended mid-toast, faces frozen in expressions of shock. Caldwell sat at the head, gray-haired and distinguished-looking, wearing a military dress uniform despite his retirement. His eyes found McKenna, and something flickered across his face, recognition, then calculation, then carefully constructed confusion. "Ma'am, I think you've made a mistake," he said smoothly. "This is a private dinner. If you need something, you can speak with my foreman in the morning." McKenna shot him in the leg. The gunshot was deafening in the enclosed space. Caldwell went down screaming, blood pooling on expensive carpet, while his guests scrambled backward in panic. McKenna's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. "Gentlemen, I'll give you one chance to leave. Anyone still in this room in 30 seconds dies." They ran. All of them, stumbling over each other, abandoning their host without hesitation. So much for loyalty among powerful men. Caldwell clutched his leg, face pale with shock and pain, while McKenna stood over him with the gun still leveled at his head. 15 years, she said quietly. 15 years I've dreamed of this moment. Played it out in my mind 1,000 different ways. She glanced at Takoda. "Want to know the funny part? I was going to kill you clean. Quick bullet, minimal suffering. Seemed like justice. But then I realized, you don't deserve clean. You deserve to drown in everything you've done." Outside, gunfire erupted as warriors engaged Caldwell's men. Shouts, screams, breaking glass. Nayeli moved to the window and saw the bunkhouse in flames, men pouring out with hands raised. Most were being disarmed and corralled, not killed. Kayleigh had listened. She turned back to find her father kneeling beside Caldwell, and the expression on Takoda's face was something she'd never seen before, pure, distilled hatred. "Do you remember her name?" Takoda asked. "My wife. The woman you killed. Do you even remember her name?" Caldwell, trying to maintain composure despite agony, shook his head. I never killed anyone personally. I'm a rancher, not a." Takoda hit him. Not hard, just a slap, but it carried all the weight of 15 years of grief. "Her name was Adsila. She liked to sing while she cooked. She taught our daughters to track rabbits. She made me laugh every single day." His voice broke. And you had her murdered for your career advancement. You leaked our location to men you knew would kill everyone there. 37 people died so you could look like a hero for responding to a savage uprising that never happened. Caldwell's carefully constructed facade cracked. They were going to expose me. The investigation you were running, it would have destroyed everything. I couldn't let that happen. You understand that, right? A man does what he must to survive. Nayeli felt something cold settle in her chest. She'd killed for money, but at least she'd never pretended it was justified. Never wrapped murder in the language of necessity. This man, this polished, distinguished officer, had slaughtered families and called it survival. Where are the records? McKenna demanded. The ledgers showing the supply theft, the payoffs, the land deals. I know you kept them. Insurance in case someone higher up tried to throw you to the wolves. Caldwell laughed, the sound wet and broken. You think I'm stupid? Think I'd keep evidence like that here? He gestured vaguely at the house. It's hidden. Somewhere you'll never find it. And if I die, it gets released anyway, along with documentation of your role in moving those Apache off the books. We'll both burn, McKenna. That's the deal we made with our choices. McKenna's hand tightened on the gun, knuckles white with restraint. Where? It wasn't a question anymore. It was a command backed by the kind of violence that needed no elaboration. Caldwell's smile was bloody, triumphant even in defeat. A bank in Santa Fe. Deposit box under a false name. Instructions to release everything to newspapers and federal marshals if I miss 3 consecutive monthly check-ins. I missed one last week because of complications. Miss 2 more and your precious survivors become headline news. The government will hunt them down like the fugitives they technically are. He shifted, crying out as the movement jolted his wounded leg, then continued with vicious satisfaction. You can kill me right now. Please, go ahead. But you'll be signing their death warrants, and we both know you don't have that in you anymore. You've gone soft, McKenna. Time was, you'd have burned this whole territory to achieve your goals. Now you're worried about mercy, about doing things the right way. His eyes found Dakota. She's always been weak when it counted. That's why Black Creek happened. She hesitated to eliminate threats, and good people paid the price. The words hit Dakota like physical blows. Nayeli saw her father's face crumple, saw decades of carefully maintained forgiveness crack and shatter. He'd spent 15 years telling himself that McKenna had done her best in an impossible situation, that no one could have predicted the betrayal. But Caldwell's words, cruel and calculated, found the wound that had never fully healed. Is that true? Dakota asked quietly. Did you know he was a threat? Did you suspect him before Black Creek? McKenna's silence lasted 3 seconds too long. I had concerns. Irregularities in his reports. Times when he seemed to know things he shouldn't. But I had no proof, and I couldn't risk accusing a military officer without evidence. I thought if we completed the investigation, if we gathered enough material to expose the whole system, individual suspicions wouldn't matter. Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. I was wrong. I prioritized the big picture over immediate danger, and your wife paid for my mistake. The room felt airless, suffocating with truths that had festered too long in darkness. Nayeli understood suddenly why her father had never sent those letters, why he'd written them but kept them locked away. This wasn't love that had survived tragedy. This was love that had died at Black Creek and left behind only the ghost of what it had been, haunting them both with what might have been if different choices had been made. You knew, Dakota said, and the devastation in his voice aged him 20 years in an instant. Some part of you knew he was dangerous, and you said nothing. You prioritized your investigation over our safety. McKenna's face finally showed the full weight of her guilt. Yes. Just that. No justifications, no excuses. The honesty was more brutal than any lie. Dakota stood, swaying slightly, and walked toward the door. Where are you going? Nayeli called after him. He didn't turn. Away from both of you. You're the same really. Killers who dress up murder in noble language. I'm done with all of it. He was gone before anyone could stop him, disappeared into the chaos outside, leaving Nayeli torn between following her father and finishing what they'd started. She chose her father, chose family over revenge, and ran after him into the night. The compound was organized chaos now, Caldwell's men disarmed and sitting under guard while warriors searched buildings for weapons and evidence. Fires burned in 3 locations, painting everything in hellish orange light. She found Dakota at the corral, leaning against a fence post, his body shaking with sobs he'd held back for 15 years. "Papa," she said softly. He didn't acknowledge her. She could have saved her. One warning, one word of caution, and Mama would have moved you girls somewhere safer that day. But McKenna was so focused on the big picture, on saving hundreds, that she sacrificed dozens. He finally looked at Nayeli, his face wet with tears. "And I forgave her. Wrote her letters every month, pouring out my heart, because I convinced myself she'd done the best she could. But she hadn't. She'd made a calculated choice to gamble with our lives, and she lost, and I've been lying to myself ever since." Nayeli had no words. What could she say? That her father was wrong? He wasn't. That McKenna deserved his forgiveness? She didn't. That the past could be changed? It couldn't. She stood beside him in silence, watching the compound burn, and realized with sudden clarity that this was what her father had been trying to teach her all along, that violence, even justified violence, even necessary violence, always cost more than it gained. She'd killed 14 men before understanding that lesson. McKenna had betrayed dozens before learning it. And Caldwell had slaughtered 37 without learning it at all. "What do we do now?" she finally asked. Dakota wiped his face with shaking hands. "We get those records. We make sure he can't hurt anyone else. And then we walk away from all of this. The revenge, the justice, the endless cycle of blood. We go home, if there's still a home to go back to, and we try to build something that isn't founded on corpses and lies." But before they could move, an explosion rocked the main house. The blast wave knocked Nayeli off her feet, threw her father against the fence with bone-jarring impact. When her ears stopped ringing, when she could see through the dust and debris, the house was collapsing in on itself, flames roaring through what remained. "No," she whispered, scrambling to her feet. Seatlali and Ixchel had been searching the second floor. McKenna had been with Caldwell in the dining room. Warriors had been clearing the eastern wing. The building came down like a falling giant, timber and stone crushing everything beneath, and Nayeli was running before thought caught up with action, running toward the inferno, screaming her sister's names, knowing it was futile but unable to stop herself. Hands grabbed her, Kayleigh and 2 other warriors, holding her back as the house became a funeral pyre. "They're gone," Kayleigh said, not unkindly. "No one survives that." But Nayeli fought against his grip, fought with everything she had, because accepting their deaths meant accepting that everything, all the violence, all the choices, all the pain, had been for nothing. Then, like ghosts emerging from hell, figures stumbled from the wreckage. Seatlali first, carrying Ixchel, both covered in blood and ash. Then McKenna, dragging an unconscious warrior, her clothes on fire until she rolled in the dirt. 5 more warriors appeared, coughing and burned, but alive. They'd gotten out. Impossibly, miraculously, they'd gotten out. But as Nayeli counted heads, as she saw who'd made it and who hadn't, her relief curdled. 3 warriors missing. And Caldwell, whether dead in the explosion or escaped in the chaos, was gone. Someone had set that explosion deliberately, timed it to create maximum confusion, maximum opportunity. The compound was chaos now, everyone trying to account for their people, tend to the wounded, search for survivors. In that chaos, a man with Caldwell's resources and connections could disappear completely. Could reach Santa Fe, secure those records, and ensure that everyone here faced consequences while he walked free once again. It was happening again, Nayeli realized. He was going to escape justice again, and this time people she loved were paying the price. Dawn came harsh and unforgiving, painting the compound's ruins in shades of ash and blood. 3 warriors had died in the explosion, needies, who'd argued for mercy over massacre, and 2 young men barely into their 20s. Their bodies lay wrapped in blankets while the survivors gathered in numb silence. Seatlali's arm was broken, set roughly with splints and cloth. Ixchel had burns across her back that made every breath agony. McKenna looked like she'd aged a decade overnight, her face smoke-blackened and hollow with exhaustion. They'd won the battle but lost the war. Caldwell had vanished, probably riding hard for Santa Fe with enough head start to make pursuit futile. In 6 days, he'd make his check-in at the bank, and all this sacrifice would accomplish nothing. The survivors would remain fugitives, the dead would have died for nothing, and Caldwell would continue destroying lives with impunity. "We have to go after him," Citlali said, her voice raw from smoke inhalation. "We can't let him reach that bank." McKenna shook her head. "He's got a full night's head start. He'll have fresh horses waiting at way stations, friends who'll hide him, resources we can't match. By the time we reach Santa Fe, he'll be surrounded by lawyers and politicians, untouchable." She looked at the gathered warriors, at Dakota standing apart from everyone, at the 3 blanket-wrapped bodies. "I'm sorry. I led you into this believing we could win, and all I did was get good people killed for my pride." Kayleigh stepped forward, his face hard. "This wasn't about your pride. This was about justice for our families. And it's not over. We track him. We hunt him. We end this." But even as he spoke, Nayeli heard the doubt underneath. They were exhausted, injured, and he was right about Caldwell's advantages. This was a chase they couldn't win through conventional means. Then Grandmother Chaveo spoke, her ancient voice cutting through the arguments. "There's another way. A faster way." She looked at Nayeli with eyes that seemed to see through flesh to the secrets beneath. "You worked for the mining consortiums. You know their routes, their schedules. There's a supply train that runs from here to Santa Fe, isn't there? Cuts through the mountains on private rail lines." Nayeli nodded slowly, understanding dawning. "The Consolidated Silver Company runs a weekly shipment. They move ore and other things. They have agreements with every law enforcement agency and military installation between here and Santa Fe. No one stops their trains. No one inspects their cargo. They could move a whole army if they wanted to, and no one would know." She paused, the old shame rising. "I used to coordinate their security. Made sure nobody interfered with their operations. That included making sure certain people didn't interfere permanently." The admission hung in the air like smoke. Her sisters stared at her with dawning horror. Dakota's face went carefully blank. She'd never told them the full extent of what she'd done during those 2 years away. "The train leaves from Copper Ridge Station tomorrow at dawn," Nayeli continued, her voice steady despite the shame burning in her chest. "It reaches Santa Fe 48 hours later. If we can get on that train, if we can reach Santa Fe before Caldwell, we might have a chance." McKenna studied her with new assessment, seeing past the trader's daughter to the weapon beneath. "Getting on that train means going through Consolidated Security. They'll recognize you, won't they? The people you worked with?" Nayeli nodded. "Some will. But I'm betting they'll also remember that I was good at my job and that I left on good terms. They'll listen if I tell them I need passage for a private security matter." It was a gamble built on reputation she'd hoped never to use again, on connections she tried to sever. But her father's words from the night before echoed in her mind, "Make sure he can't hurt anyone else." This was how. This was the cost of stopping Caldwell. "There's something else," Grandmother Chaveo said, her gaze still fixed on Nayeli with uncomfortable intensity. "Something you should know about your mother, child. About why she died the way she did." The old woman reached into her dress and pulled out a folded letter, yellowed with age. "Atsila gave this to me the morning of Black Creek. Said if anything happened to her, I should give it to you when you were old enough to understand. I think that time has come." Nayeli took the letter with shaking hands. Her mother's handwriting, careful, precise, beautiful, covered both sides of the page. She read aloud, her voice breaking, "My daughter, if you are reading this, I am gone, and you are old enough to carry the weight of truth. I knew Black Creek was compromised. Knew someone had betrayed our location. I told your father to take you girls and run, but he refused to abandon the others without proof. So I made a choice. I told McKenna that if she got you and your sisters out, I would stay behind to make sure the evacuation succeeded. She argued. We fought. But I convinced her it was the only way. She never forgave herself for accepting my sacrifice. Your father never knew I chose this. Let him keep thinking I died by accident, by bad luck, by anything except my own choice. But you, my fierce girl, you deserve to know, I chose to die so you could live. Not because life wasn't precious to me, but because yours was more precious than my own. Live well. Live better than we did. Love is not weakness. Never let anyone tell you otherwise. The silence that followed was absolute. Nayeli felt the world tilt, felt 15 years of understanding crack and reform into something new and terrible. Her mother had known. Had chosen. McKenna hadn't gambled with their lives. Edsela had forced her hand, made her choose between honoring a dying woman's wish and respecting Takoda's authority. Either choice would have been wrong. Either choice would have haunted her. Did you know? Nayeli asked McKenna, her voice hollow. The older woman nodded slowly. She made me swear never to tell. Said Takoda needed someone to blame who wasn't her, wasn't himself, wasn't fate. So I carried it. Let him write those letters full of accusations I couldn't defend against without breaking my promise to her. She laughed bitterly. You want to know the real joke? I wrote back to every single one. Never sent them, just like he never sent his. Just kept writing, kept explaining what I couldn't explain, kept apologizing for surviving when she didn't. Takoda approached slowly, drawn by the sound of his dead wife's name spoken aloud. What is that? He asked, pointing at the letter. Nayeli handed it to him without speaking. She watched his face as he read, watched 15 years of carefully constructed narrative crumble. When he finished, he sank to the ground like a puppet with cut strings. She knew, he whispered. She knew and she didn't tell me. She let me think. He couldn't finish. Couldn't articulate the magnitude of misplaced anger, of wasted grief, of love that had curdled into resentment over a lie told kindly. McKenna knelt beside him, and this time when she spoke, there was no defensiveness, no justification. I'm sorry. I should have told you years ago. Should have broken my promise to honor the truth. But I was a coward. I let you hate me because it was easier than making you hate her memory. And that was wrong. I failed you both. She placed her hand over his, tentative, expecting rejection. He didn't pull away. They knelt there in the ash and ruins, two people who'd loved the same woman in different ways, who'd let her death poison what should have been shared grief, finally finding something like understanding. Citlali broke the silence, pragmatic as always despite her injuries. This doesn't change what we need to do. Caldwell is still running. The train is still our best option. We can have our emotional reckoning after we stop him. She looked at Nayeli. Can you really get us on that train? Nayeli thought of the men she'd worked with, the favors owed and debts accumulated. Thought of James Warwick, the security chief who'd trained her, who'd looked the other way when she decided to leave rather than take another wet work contract. He'd said once that she'd always have a place in his organization if she changed her mind. Time to see if he'd meant it. I can get me on the train, she said carefully. Getting all of us might be harder. Consolidated doesn't like complications, and we look like a whole freight car full of complications right now. McKenna stood, brushing ash from her clothes. Then we make ourselves look less complicated. We split up. Small group goes with you as hired security. The rest circle around, meet us in Santa Fe through conventional routes. It was a risk. It split their forces, left them vulnerable. But it was also their only real chance. The train, or surrender. Kayleigh volunteered immediately, along with two other warriors. Grandmother Cheveo insisted on coming despite her age. I was there at the beginning, she said firmly. I'll be there at the end. Takoda and McKenna looked at each other, some silent communication passing between them, and nodded in unison. Citlali tried to volunteer, but her broken arm made her a liability. She and Ixchel would travel with the main group, slower but safer. Nayeli felt relief at that. At least her sisters would be away from the immediate danger. They had 4 hours to reach Copper Ridge Station before the train departed. 4 hours to transform themselves from what they were, bloodied, ash-covered, marked by violence, into something security guards would believe belonged on a corporate train. They raided what remained of Caldwell's compound, finding clothes that fit well enough, washing away the visible evidence of battle. Nayeli found her old persona settling back over her like a familiar coat, the coldness, the calculation, the absolute certainty that had made her so effective at her former profession. She tried to bury this part of herself. But maybe you never really left who you'd been. Maybe you just paused, waiting for the moment when that version of yourself was needed again. Copper Ridge Station sat in a canyon carved by centuries of water and wind, a slash of green in otherwise brutal terrain. The train waited on the tracks like a steel serpent, 5 cars long, painted in consolidated silver company colors, black with gold trim. Guards patrolled the platform, rifles casual but ready, and Nayeli recognized 3 of them immediately. Simmons, who'd taught her to shoot moving targets. Ortega, who'd covered for her when she'd gotten drunk and missed a patrol. And James Warwick himself, older now but still carrying authority like a second skin. He saw her coming and his hand didn't go to his weapon, which was the first good sign. The second was that he actually smiled. "Heard you'd gone respectable," he called out. "Rumors of my reformation were greatly exaggerated," Nayeli replied, falling into old patterns of banter. "I need a favor, James. A big one." His smile faded as he took in her companions, McKenna's predatory stillness, Kayleigh's barely contained violence, Grandmother Cheveo's ancient, knowing eyes. What kind of favor? Nayeli had prepared 3 different lies, each calibrated to appeal to different aspects of James's personality. But standing there, looking at a man who'd trusted her when she'd been drowning in self-destruction, she found she couldn't lie. The kind where you don't ask questions, and I owe you for the rest of my life. James studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he gestured to the train. "Car 3. Don't cause trouble, don't talk to the other passengers, and if anyone asks, you're consulting security reviewing route vulnerabilities. We reach Santa Fe in 48 hours. After that, you're on your own." He leaned closer, voice dropping. "Nayeli, whatever you're into, it smells like the kind of trouble that ends careers. Mine specifically if this goes wrong. So make sure it doesn't go wrong." She clasped his arm, the gesture carrying weight of debts acknowledged. "Thank you." He snorted. "Thank me by staying alive. Dead people make terrible assets." The train interior was surprisingly luxurious, plush seats, polished wood paneling, oil lamps casting warm light. They'd barely settled when the locomotive lurched forward, beginning its journey through mountains where bandits and nature competed to be the greater threat. Nayeli sat beside a window, watching the landscape blur past, and tried not to think about what they'd do if Caldwell had already reached Santa Fe. Tried not to calculate odds that kept coming up dismal. McKenna sat across from her, cleaning weapons with mechanical precision. "You're good at this," the older woman said without looking up. "The lying, the calculation, the wearing of masks. Your father thinks you left that life behind, but it's still right there under your skin, isn't it?" Nayeli bristled. "I'm not killing for money anymore, if that's what you're implying." McKenna's hands paused. "I'm not judging. I'm saying I recognize it. We're the same, you and I. We're weapons that try to be people. Sometimes we succeed. Sometimes we don't. The trick is knowing which moments require which version of yourself." "Is that what you tell yourself?" Nayeli asked. "That you're just using the right tool for the job? Doesn't that convenient philosophy let you justify almost anything?" The words came out harder than intended, carrying venom accumulated over years of her father's pain. McKenna finally looked up, meeting her eyes directly. "Yes, it does. And I've used it to justify terrible things. But here's what I've learned. The philosophy doesn't matter nearly as much as what you do after. Do you learn from your mistakes, or do you repeat them? Do you try to be better, or do you embrace being worse? Your mother chose to be better. Your father chose to be better. Even you, running away from your career, chose to be better. Caldwell chose to be worse. That's the only difference that actually counts." Before Nayeli could respond, Kayleigh appeared from the next car, his expression urgent. "We have a problem." The problem was in car 4, surrounded by guards and looking entirely too comfortable. Marcus Caldwell sat in a private compartment, his wounded leg bandaged but clearly treated by a competent physician, drinking whiskey and reviewing documents. He'd reached the train ahead of them, must have had arrangements in place, backup plans within backup plans. And now they were trapped together in a metal tube hurtling through mountains, with consolidated security between them and their target. "He's traveling under protection," Kayleigh whispered. "Claimed he was attacked by Apache raiders, needs escort to Santa Fe for his safety." Warwick's boss ordered full security detail. 6 guards in his car alone. McKenna cursed quietly but viciously. He knew we'd try the train. Knew it was the only way to beat him to Santa Fe. So he made sure he'd be protected. She looked at Nayeli. "Can we trust your friend Warwick?" Nayeli shook her head. "Not against direct orders from his superiors. James will look the other way for smuggling or small problems, but killing a passenger under consolidated protection? He'd put me down himself." They retreated to their car to strategize, aware that time was working against them. The train wouldn't stop until Santa Fe unless emergency conditions forced it. Rock slide, broken rail, attack. Attacking Caldwell directly meant going through guards who were just doing their job, men who had no stake in old crimes and didn't deserve to die for being in the wrong place. But letting him reach Santa Fe meant watching him disappear into political protection they couldn't penetrate. "We derail the train," Kayleigh suggested. McKenna shook her head. "Too many innocent passengers. We're trying to stop a man who kills innocent people, not become him." Grandmother Chaveo spoke up, her voice papery but certain. "We don't need to kill him. We just need to get those documents from the Santa Fe bank before he does. The check-in is at the main branch, yes? He'll go there directly from the station. So we arrive first, get the documents, and he has no leverage." Nayeli saw the flaw immediately. "We don't know the false name. Don't know which box. The bank won't just hand over records without legal authority." The old woman smiled, and there was something predatory in it. "Then we make them think we have legal authority. You're good at lying, child. Time to prove how good." The plan came together piece by piece over the next hour, each element a gamble stacked on other gambles. When the train stopped at a way station for water and coal, a 30-minute pause, Nayeli would slip off and send telegrams ahead to Santa Fe. Official-looking telegrams from fictional federal authorities, requesting specific bank records be prepared for immediate review upon arrival. Forgery was a crime, but it was a lesser crime than murder. Meanwhile, McKenna would create a distraction that would occupy Caldwell and his guards, keep them from noticing Nayeli's absence. The distraction would need to be significant enough to hold attention but not so dramatic that it stopped the train entirely or triggered lockdown procedures. "I'll confess," McKenna said simply. "I'll tell Warwick who I really am, what we're really doing. He'll have to detain me, question me. That'll bring Caldwell's guards running to watch, to make sure I don't escape. You'll have your window. They'll arrest you," Dakota protested. "You'll be in custody when we reach Santa Fe." McKenna shrugged. "Then break me out. You're all very good at violence when necessary." She looked at Nayeli. "Can you do this alone? Get off the train, send the telegrams, get back on before it leaves? 30 minutes isn't much time." Nayeli had infiltrated tighter security on shorter timelines. Had talked her way past guards who should have shot her on sight. This was what she'd been, what some part of her still was, a professional operator in spaces where most people panicked. "I can do it." The question wasn't capability. The question was whether she wanted to fully become that person again, whether using those skills opened doors that would never close afterward. But looking at her father's face, at the hope struggling against despair, she realized the choice had been made at Black Creek 15 years ago. She'd just been too young to know it then. Some debts get paid in blood. Some get paid in becoming the thing you swore you'd never be. Both hurt the same. The way station appeared exactly on schedule, a ramshackle collection of buildings clinging to canyon walls like lichen on stone. As the train shuddered to a halt, as workers swarmed around the locomotive with water hoses and coal shovels, McKenna walked deliberately toward Car 4 where Caldwell waited. Nayeli slipped out the opposite side, moving low and fast, using the train itself as cover from the platform. The station's telegraph office was a lean-to structure that probably violated every safety regulation ever written, operated by a kid who couldn't have been more than 17. He looked up from a dime novel as Nayeli entered, and his eyes went wide at her intensity. I need to send 3 telegrams, she said, laying coins on the counter. Priority delivery, Santa Fe destinations. She'd written them on the train, carefully worded forgeries that mentioned federal investigations, document preservation, cooperation with authorities. Official-sounding nonsense that would make a bank manager nervous enough to comply. The kid sent them without questioning, his fingers flying over the telegraph key with practiced speed. Through the window, Nayeli could see commotion on the train, guards rushing toward car 4, passengers craning to see what was happening. McKenna's distraction was working. But the 30-minute window was shrinking fast, and getting back onto the train without being seen would be harder than getting off. She'd need a different approach, a different car. She thanked the telegraph operator and ran, circling wide around the station, timing her approach to coincide with the workers finishing their tasks. The locomotive was already building steam pressure, the engineer checking gauges. 5 minutes, maybe less. She reached the rear car, cargo, mostly empty except for locked crates, and hauled herself up just as the train lurched forward. She'd made it. Barely. But lying flat on the cargo car floor, trying to catch her breath, she heard footsteps. Someone else had slipped onto the train during the chaos. Someone moving with predatory care through the shadows between crates. Nayeli's knife was in her hand before thought. She rolled behind cover as a figure emerged into lamplight. Young man, maybe 25, wearing clothes too fine for a railroad worker but too practical for a passenger. He carried a rifle like someone born to it, and his face was familiar in ways that made her chest tighten. He had Caldwell's eyes. The same cold calculation, the same absence of mercy. "You're one of the Apache," he said conversationally, not pointing the rifle but not lowering it either. "My father told me about you. Said you'd probably try something desperate." He smiled, and the expression was his father's cruelty wrapped in younger skin. "I'm Dylan Caldwell. And you just made a fatal mistake. My father's not going to the main bank branch in Santa Fe. He's going to the one on Alameda Street, under a completely different name than you're probably looking for. Your telegrams, and yes, I watched you send them, just wasted your last chance." He raised the rifle slowly. "Nothing personal. You're just a loose end that needs tying off." And Nayeli, hearing her own death in his words, realized that some evils breed true. That Caldwell hadn't just destroyed the past, he'd infected the future. That killing one monster wouldn't save anyone if his children carried the same poison. The knife left her hand before conscious decision. It wasn't the best throw, the train's motion threw off her aim, but it was good enough. The blade caught Dylan in the shoulder, spinning him sideways, the rifle discharging into wooden crates. Nayeli was on him before he could recover, years of training overriding moral hesitation. They fought in brutal silence, each knowing that the first one to make enough noise to attract guards would lose everything. He was stronger but she was faster. He was ruthless but she was more experienced. When her knee connected with his wounded shoulder, when he screamed despite himself, when his head cracked against a crate with sickening force, she stood over him breathing hard, trying to decide if she just killed Caldwell's son or merely incapacitated him. His chest rose and fell shallowly. Alive? For now. She zip-tied his hands with cord from the cargo crates, gagged him with his own bandana, and dragged him behind a stack of mining equipment where he wouldn't be immediately visible. Then she sat down hard, shaking with adrenaline crash and moral exhaustion. She tried so hard to leave this behind. Tried so hard to be someone her mother would be proud of. But here she was again, covered in someone else's blood, having made choices that couldn't be unmade. Santa Fe appeared through morning mist like a city materializing from dreams, adobe buildings painted in sunrise colors, church bells calling the faithful, streets already bustling with commerce and intrigue. The train pulled into the station exactly on schedule, and Nayeli emerged from the cargo car before guards could discover Dylan still unconscious behind the mining equipment. She'd left him alive, but bound tightly enough that he wouldn't be a problem for hours. That felt like mercy. Maybe it was just cowardice, an unwillingness to add a 15th kill to the count she still carried. Either way, he'd survive to hate her another day. Some problems you solved. Some problems you just delayed. McKenna was already off the train, released from consolidated custody the moment they'd reached city limits where the company's authority ended. She looked exhausted but focused, every movement purposeful as she gathered their scattered group. "Dylan told me something before I incapacitated him," Nayeli said without preamble. "Caldwell's not going to the main bank branch. He's going to one on Alameda Street, under a different name than we've been assuming. We need to split up, cover both locations." McKenna's eyes narrowed. If the son knew where his father was really going, why tell you? Why give away the advantage? The question hung unanswered because there was no good answer, just a bad feeling that they were missing something crucial. Dakota, who'd been silent since leaving the train, finally spoke. "It's a trap. Has to be. He's expecting us at one location while he's actually at a third. Or he's got men waiting at both to ambush whoever shows up. We're thinking like hunters when we should be thinking like prey." The reversal in perspective was jarring but correct. They'd been acting like they had the upper hand, but Caldwell had resources they couldn't match, connections they couldn't counter. He'd been playing this game longer and with higher stakes. They were amateurs pretending at professionalism. Grandmother Chaveo pulled a small pouch from inside her dress, opened it to reveal white powder. "Peyote," she said simply. "Before we scatter, before we make choices that might get us killed, I need to show you something. All of you. A vision that's been trying to reach me since Black Creek, but I kept pushing away because I was afraid of what it meant." No one protested. In crisis, people reached for whatever anchor presented itself: law, faith, tradition, or in this case, medicine that promised clarity through altered consciousness. They found a quiet alley behind a closed mercantile, and Grandmother Chaveo prepared the bitter tea with practiced efficiency. "Drink," she commanded, and they drank. Nayeli felt the world tilt within minutes, colors intensifying, sounds taking on musical qualities, and then she was falling backward through time, landing in a memory that wasn't hers. Black Creek, 15 years ago. She saw through her mother's eyes, felt at Sela's certainty that death was coming, watched her make the choice that had defined everyone's future. But the vision didn't stop there. It kept going forward, showing what happened after. Showed McKenna keeping her promise, moving the survivors, establishing them in hidden canyons. Showed Dakota raising 3 daughters alone, teaching them to be strong because he couldn't bear for them to be vulnerable like their mother. Showed Caldwell climbing through military and political ranks on a foundation of stolen valor and murdered witnesses. Showed Luther Kane taking contracts from the rancher to eliminate anyone who got too close to old truths. And then the vision showed something that hadn't happened yet, something that might happen depending on choices made in the next few hours. 2 paths, diverging. In one, they found Caldwell at the bank, killed him publicly, and spent the rest of their lives running from the legal consequences because he'd prepared for martyrdom. Witnesses, planted evidence, testimony from respected citizens, all designed to make him a victim and them terrorists. In the other path, they didn't kill him. They exposed him. Used the documents he'd so carefully hidden against him in ways that couldn't be dismissed or buried. But that path required something none of them wanted to give. It required mercy toward someone who, but that path required something none of them wanted to give. It required mercy toward someone who'd never shown any restraint when rage demanded release, faith in a system that had already failed them once. The vision faded slowly, leaving them sitting in the alley with tears streaming down faces, understanding finally landing with the weight of revelation. Grandmother Chaveo spoke first, her voice trembling with emotion she rarely showed. "We are not here to kill Marcus Caldwell. We are here to save ourselves from becoming him. The ancestors are clear on this. Justice and revenge wear similar clothes, but only one lets you sleep at night. Only one lets you return home with your humanity intact." Kale slammed his fist against the adobe wall. "He murdered my aunt. He destroyed dozens of families. And you're saying we should let him walk?" The old woman shook her head. "I'm saying we should let the truth walk. Let it walk into newspapers and federal offices and congressional hearings. Let it walk into history books and courtrooms. Bullets are fast, but truth is forever. Which one actually scares men like Caldwell?" The question hung in the air while the peyote's effects slowly receded, leaving behind clarity that felt like cold water to the face. Nayeli understood suddenly why her mother had chosen sacrifice over survival, not because life was worthless, but because some things mattered more than one person's continuation. Edsela had believed that enough people surviving with truth intact was worth more than everyone surviving with lies. She'd bet her life on that belief. Now they had to decide if they believed it too. Alameda Street is misdirection, McKenna said, her voice rough from emotion. But the main branch is too obvious. Caldwell's smarter than that, he'd expect us to cover both, so he'd choose a third option. She looked at Dakota. You know him better than any of us. You studied him for 3 years while we built the investigation. Where would he actually go? Dakota closed his eyes, thinking, and when he opened them again, there was bitter certainty there. The courthouse. There's a bank inside the territorial courthouse that handles official bonds and legal deposits. It's the one place in Santa Fe where he can access his safety deposit box while surrounded by marshals and judges. We can't touch him there without starting a massacre in a building full of innocent clerks and citizens. That's where he'd go, somewhere we'd hesitate to follow. Nayeli felt sick recognition. Of course Caldwell would choose the most publicly protected space possible. The man was a coward wearing a hero's costume. He'd always chosen positions where others would die before him. They had less than 2 hours before Caldwell would make his check-in. 2 hours to accomplish what months of planning hadn't achieved. We can't attack the courthouse, McKenna said. But we can enter it legally. File documents, request public records, attend hearings. We can be inside when he arrives, watching, waiting for a moment when he's vulnerable. She looked at Nayeli. Those telegrams you sent, they established a federal investigation cover story. Use it. Walk into that courthouse like you belong there, flash confidence and paperwork, and get access to the records room. If we can see which box he accesses, which name he uses, we can file a legal challenge to those records immediately after he leaves. Force them into public disclosure. It was absurdly mundane compared to the violence they'd been contemplating. No dramatic shootout, no heroic last stand. Just bureaucracy and legal maneuvering. But bureaucracy had teeth when wielded correctly. And legal challenges created paper trails that men like Caldwell couldn't simply murder away. They separated into 3 groups. Kayleigh and 2 warriors would position themselves outside the courthouse, watching for escape attempts or betrayal. Dakota and Grandmother Chaveo would go to the Santa Fe newspaper office with a written testimony about Black Creek, the stolen supplies, the manufactured conflicts, everything they had documentation for. If anything went wrong at the courthouse, if violence erupted despite their plans, at least the truth would already be in journalists' hands, too distributed to suppress. And Nayeli would go with McKenna into the courthouse itself, 2 women with forged credentials and authentic rage, betting everything on the slim chance that the system could still deliver justice when properly leveraged. As they walked toward the imposing adobe structure with its American flag snapping in high-altitude wind, Nayeli found herself thinking about her mother's letter. About choices made not because they guaranteed success, but because they offered the only path that let you look at yourself in the mirror afterward. The courthouse interior was chaos organized into narrow bureaucracy, clerks rushing between offices, lawyers arguing in alcoves, citizens waiting on hard benches for their turn at various forms of official processing. Nayeli and McKenna moved through it with the confidence of people who belonged, who knew exactly where they were going even when they didn't. They found the records office on the 2nd floor, and Nayeli's forged credentials worked exactly as hoped. The clerk barely glanced at them before nodding them toward the viewing room. Bank deposit boxes are accessed through the vault downstairs, the clerk said absently. But if you need to witness the transaction for your investigation, I'll need authorization from the territorial marshal. Another complication, another bureaucratic hurdle. McKenna pulled a second forged document from her coat, this one claiming urgent federal priority. The clerk frowned, clearly uncertain, but ultimately the magic words, federal investigation, carried weight that local protocols couldn't override. They were directed downstairs to a waiting area outside the vault, told they could observe but not interfere with any transactions. Caldwell arrived 30 minutes later, walking with a cane but moving with the arrogance of a man who believed himself untouchable. He was flanked by two well-dressed men Nayeli recognized from wanted posters, hired guns pretending to be lawyers, protection disguised as legal representation. He saw them immediately. For a moment, everyone froze, hands drifting toward weapons, violence hanging in the air like humidity before a storm. Then Caldwell smiled, that same vicious, scarred smile he'd worn in the clearing when he'd strung up the sisters. "Ladies," he said pleasantly, "I was wondering if you'd figure it out in time. Congratulations. You're smarter than I gave you credit for." He gestured to the marshal standing nearby. "These women have been harassing me for days. Attacked my home, killed my security staff, and now they're impersonating federal officers. I want them arrested immediately." The marshal looked between them, clearly uncertain who to believe. McKenna spoke before Nayeli could, her voice calm and reasonable. "Marshal, we're here on official business investigating corruption in military supply contracts during the Apache Wars. Mr. Caldwell is a person of interest in that investigation. These documents authorize our presence." She handed over their forged papers. The marshal examined them with agonizing slowness while Caldwell's men moved to flank the exit. This was the moment, Nayeli realized. This was where everything would collapse or somehow, impossibly hold together. The marshal looked up, and his expression was professionally neutral. "Your documents appear to be in order. However, Mr. Caldwell's concerns about harassment need to be addressed. I'll allow you to observe his transaction as authorized, but afterward, you'll need to come to my office to answer questions about your investigation's scope and methods." It was a compromise that satisfied no one but prevented immediate violence. Caldwell's jaw tightened with frustrated rage, but he couldn't argue without appearing guilty of something. McKenna and Nayeli nodded acceptance, knowing they'd have to face interrogation later but that the immediate goal, witnessing Caldwell's transaction, was within reach. The vault door was opened by two clerks working in tandem, each with half of the combination. Inside, rows of deposit boxes gleamed in lamplight. Caldwell moved directly to box 247, used a key from his pocket, and withdrew a thick leather portfolio. He opened it carefully, showing the marshal its contents as required by protocol: stacks of documents, photographs, ledgers. "Personal business records," he said smoothly. "Nothing that concerns any supposed federal investigation." But Nayeli had seen enough in that brief glimpse to understand what they were looking at. Evidence, meticulously organized. But not evidence against Caldwell, evidence against everyone who'd ever worked with him, everyone who'd accepted bribes or looked the other way, everyone whose careers were built on the same foundation of corruption and blood money. This was his insurance, his guarantee that no one would ever move against him because doing so would bring down half the territorial government. He'd documented his own crimes, but he'd documented everyone else's too, creating a web of mutual culpability that protected him better than any army. "We need to file a subpoena," McKenna whispered urgently. "Right now, before he leaves. Get a judge to order those documents seized as evidence." But before they could move, before they could even turn toward the door, Dakota burst into the vault room, wild-eyed and desperate. Behind him came a clerk from the newspaper office, and the man was shouting, "Fire! The Santa Fe Courier offices are burning. Someone set the building on fire." Nayeli's heart dropped into her stomach. Grandmother Cheveo had been there. Their written testimony had been there. And now it was burning, which meant Caldwell had contingency plans even for contingency plans. Caldwell's smile widened. "Terrible tragedy. I hope everyone got out safely. These old buildings, you know, tinderboxes waiting for a spark." The implication was clear. He'd ordered it burned the moment he'd seen them at the courthouse, eliminating their backup plan while they were distracted watching him. Dakota lunged forward, and only McKenna's quick grab stopped him from attacking Caldwell right there in the vault. "Where is she?" Dakota roared. "Where's Cheveo? What did you do?" Caldwell shrugged, the picture of unconcerned innocence. "I've been here the entire time, as the marshal can attest. Whatever happened at that newspaper has nothing to do with me. Though I'll certainly contribute to the relief fund for any victims. I'm a pillar of this community after all." the casual cruelty, the weaponized indifference, was more enraging than any threat. This was a man who'd perfected the art of destroying lives while maintaining plausible deniability. He'd never personally pulled a trigger, never personally set a fire. He just created conditions where violence happened around him like weather, then positioned himself to benefit from the destruction. The marshal, sensing the situation deteriorating, started ushering everyone out of the vault. This transaction is complete. Everyone needs to leave now before this becomes a public disturbance. They had seconds before being separated from Caldwell, seconds before he disappeared into protection they couldn't penetrate. Nayeli's hand went to her knife, old instincts demanding action, demanding blood, demanding the simple satisfaction of ending a threat permanently. But McKenna's earlier words echoed in her head, "Bullets are fast, but truth is forever." And Grandmother Cheveo's vision had shown two paths, one leading to decades of running, one leading to something resembling peace. She made her choice. Not the choice rage demanded, but the choice her mother would have made. "Marshal," she said clearly, loudly enough for everyone in the corridor to hear, "I'm invoking federal witness protection protocols. I have testimony regarding crimes committed by Marcus Caldwell, including conspiracy to commit murder, theft of government property, and treason during wartime. I'm requesting immediate protective custody and transport to the nearest federal circuit court." It was a massive gamble. She had no actual authority to invoke those protocols. Her credentials were forged, her investigation fictional, her legal standing non-existent. But the words themselves carried weight in a courthouse, created obligations and procedures that couldn't be easily dismissed. The marshal's face showed confusion, then growing concern. This was beyond his authority, beyond his pay grade. "Ma'am, I'll need to consult with the territorial judge before." "Then consult," McKenna interrupted. "But while you're consulting, Mr. Caldwell should be prevented from leaving Santa Fe. Otherwise you'll be explaining to federal investigators why you let a material witness in a corruption case walk away." More legal theater, more bureaucratic pressure. And it was working. The marshal was a career law enforcement officer who'd survived by not taking sides in political fights. Faced with competing claims of authority, his instinct was to freeze everything until someone higher up made the decision. "Everyone stays here," he said finally. "No one leaves until Judge Wardlow reviews the situation." Caldwell's composure finally cracked. "This is absurd. I have rights. You can't detain me based on unsubstantiated claims from women who attacked my property." But the marshal was already calling for additional officers, already moving into containment mode. They were all being held. Caldwell, his hired guns, McKenna, Nayeli, everyone locked in bureaucratic amber while the system slowly ground forward. It wasn't the dramatic confrontation anyone had imagined. It was tedious and frustrating and mundane. But it was also working. Hours passed in windowless holding rooms. A territorial judge arrived, then a federal circuit judge who'd been in Santa Fe on unrelated business. Lawyers were summoned. Real investigators, not forged credentials, but actual federal agents, arrived from Denver on the evening train, summoned by telegrams from people Nayeli didn't know, people who'd apparently been waiting years for someone to finally make official accusations against Caldwell. The conspiracy was larger than they'd realized. The corruption went deeper. And their clumsy, desperate attempt to seek justice had somehow kicked a door open that dozens of other people had been pushing against for years. By midnight, Caldwell was in federal custody, his portfolio of insurance documents seized as evidence. By dawn, arrests were being made across 3 territories, politicians, military officers, land speculators, all scrambling to cut deals and testify against each other. The web of mutual culpability that had protected Caldwell for decades became the mechanism of his destruction, as everyone he documented rushed to be first to cooperate with investigators. Nayeli and McKenna were detained for another 2 days, answering questions, facing potential charges for their forged credentials and the attack on Caldwell's compound. But as the scope of Caldwell's crimes became clear, as witness after witness came forward with their own pieces of the story, the mood shifted. They weren't criminals, they were the spark that ignited overdue justice. Charges were quietly dropped in exchange for testimony. Deals were made. And somehow, impossibly, they walked free. Grandmother Cheveo had survived the fire. She'd smelled smoke before the flames spread, gotten out with only minor burns and the presence of mind to grab their written testimony before evacuating. The newspaper building was destroyed, but the documents survived, were already being copied and distributed to every major paper in the territory. Black Creek was becoming public knowledge. The survivors were emerging from 15 years of hiding, their stories corroborating each other, building an overwhelming case that couldn't be dismissed or suppressed. 3 weeks after the courthouse confrontation, Nayeli stood with her sisters and father on a hillside overlooking the Badlands where the survivors had hidden for so long. The people were coming down from the hidden canyons, returning to light and legitimacy, ready to reclaim their names and histories. Some would return to reservations, some would establish new settlements, some would simply vanish into new lives in cities where no one knew their faces. But they'd do it as people, not as ghosts. Dakota held the letters he'd written to McKenna, all of them retrieved from the ruins of Caldwell's compound. Beside him stood McKenna herself, older and worn but somehow lighter, as if years of guilt had finally been lifted. "I think I'm ready now," Dakota said quietly, "to send these. Or maybe to burn them. I haven't decided which would be better." McKenna took his hand, the gesture tentative but genuine. "Send them or burn them, but either way, stop writing new ones. We've lived in the past long enough. Time to see if we remember how to live in the present." They stood together watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of copper and gold, two people who'd loved and failed and blamed each other and finally, painstakingly, found something resembling forgiveness. Not the easy kind, but the earned kind, built on honesty and shared survival. Seat Lali and Ixchel were already planning, talking about rebuilding the trading post, establishing it as a way station for the returning survivors, creating something new from the ashes of what had been destroyed. They'd survived their hanging, survived burns and broken bones, survived the knowledge that the world was crueler than childhood had prepared them for. They'd survive this too, together. Nayeli listened to their plans and felt something unfamiliar stirring in her chest. Hope, maybe. Or just exhaustion so deep it felt like peace. She'd killed one more man during the courthouse chaos, she realized. Not with a knife, but with truth. She'd taken Marcus Caldwell's power and reputation and reduced them to ash with nothing more than words spoken loudly in the right room at the right time. Maybe that was the lesson her mother had been trying to teach all along. Violence was easy. Truth was hard. But only one of them actually changed anything. She still had nightmares about the men she'd killed before. Still woke up sometimes tasting dust and blood, feeling rope burn on her ankles, seeing Luther smile as he'd strung them up to die slowly. But she also had mornings like this one. Clean desert air, her family alive, possibilities opening where there'd only been closure before. It wasn't redemption. She didn't believe in redemption, not really. But it was something. A chance to build something better than what she'd destroyed. A chance to honor her mother's sacrifice by living well, by being better than the violence that had shaped her. The sun dropped below the horizon, and stars began appearing in the darkening sky, the same stars that had watched Black Creek burn 15 years ago, that had watched Caldwell climb to power, that had watched every tragedy and triumph in between. Indifferent stars, bearing witness to everything and nothing. Nayeli looked up at them and felt very small, but also strangely comforted. The universe didn't care about justice or revenge or any of it. But she did. Her family did. And maybe that was enough. Ready to go home? Dakota asked, and Nayeli realized she'd been holding her breath. She let it out slowly, feeling years of tension release with it. "Yeah," she said. "I'm ready." They rode together into the gathering dark, leaving the Badlands behind, heading toward whatever came next. The trading post would be rebuilt. The survivors would find new lives. Caldwell would face trial and probably hang, his legacy destroyed, his empire collapsed. And Nayeli would be there for all of it, not as a weapon, not as a tool, but as her mother's daughter, her father's child, herself finally, after so many years of being someone else. The road stretched ahead, uncertain and long. But for the first time in years, she was walking it with people she loved, toward a future she'd helped create rather than running from a past she couldn't change. It wasn't the ending anyone would have written. But it was theirs, earned in blood and forgiveness and stubborn refusal to let hate define them. And in the wild, brutal, beautiful West, that was the best anyone could hope for, to survive with some part of themselves intact, to love despite every reason not to build something worth protecting from the ashes of everything that had burned. The stars wheeled overhead, and the desert sang its ancient song, and 3 Apache sisters rode home with their father, carrying the weight of the past but no longer crushed by it. The end.